The knock on the door was not a sound Finn expected to hear, not with the snow coming down in thick, blinding sheets, erasing the world. He was a huge man, built of mountain stone and timber, with a cascade of dark hair and a beard that fell to his chest, and solitude was the price for his high-altitude peace. He moved from the stone hearth, his heavy boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. He unlatched the heavy plank door, pulling it inward just enough to peer out into the swirling white chaos. She stood there, a ghost made of desperation. She was small, so small the wind seemed ready to claim her, dressed in a dark green dress that was woefully inadequate for the cold, its fabric clinging to her shivering frame. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide with a fear so profound it seemed to have frozen solid. Snowflakes clung to her black hair like tiny, cruel jewels. For a long moment they just stared, the mountain man and the lost girl, a chasm of culture and experience between them. Then her lips, blue with cold, parted. "I have nowhere else to go." The words were a fragile whisper, nearly stolen by the wind, but they landed in the quiet of the cabin with the weight of a felled tree. Finn's expression, usually a mask of stony indifference, flickered with something unreadable. He did not speak. He simply opened the door wider, a silent invitation into the pocket of warmth and firelight he had carved out of the wilderness. She hesitated for only a second before stumbling inside, bringing a gust of freezing air with her. He shut the door, the heavy thud sealing them in, sealing the storm out. He gestured with a massive hand toward the fire, then turned to fetch a thick wool blanket from a nearby chest. An Li, for that was her name, huddled by the hearth, the rough wool blanket clutched around her shoulders. Her body still trembled, a deep, cellular shivering that had less to do with the cold and more to do with the release of terror. She watched the man, Finn, move about the one-room cabin. He was immense, his shoulders nearly brushing the low-hanging rafters, his presence filling the small space entirely. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his sheer size. He stoked the fire, adding another log that hissed and crackled, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. He didn't look at her, didn't press her with questions she had no strength to answer. Instead, he took a small pot, filled it with water from a bucket near the door, and set it on a hook over the flames. From a small sack he added dried herbs and some salted meat, the scent slowly filling the air with a savory promise of sustenance. He was a creature of routine, of quiet competence. This was his world, governed by the simple, brutal laws of survival: fire, food, shelter. He had offered her all three without a word. When the broth was ready, he ladled it into a tin cup and held it out to her. His hands were calloused and scarred, the knuckles like knots on an old rope, but his gesture was steady. She took the cup, her small hands barely encircling it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still rough. He gave a short, sharp nod and retreated to the other side of the room, giving her space. He laid out a bedroll for himself near the door, a silent declaration that the simple cot in the corner was hers. As she sipped the hot, salty broth, a warmth spread through her that was more than just physical. It was the first flicker of safety she had felt in a very long time. The next morning, the world was a canvas of white and blue. The storm had broken, leaving behind a silence so deep it seemed to have weight, the snow piled in immense drifts against the cabin walls. An Li woke on the cot, tucked under two heavy blankets, to the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood outside. She rose, her limbs stiff and sore, and went to the small, grimy window. Finn was in the clearing, his back to her. He swung the axe with an easy power, each blow landing with a clean, satisfying crack that echoed in the cold air. His hair was tied back with a leather thong, and the muscles in his back and shoulders moved under his worn shirt like bedrock shifting. He was a part of this landscape, as natural and as formidable as the pines that surrounded them. She felt a strange sense of calm watching him, a feeling of security in his raw capability. Turning from the window, she looked around the small cabin. It was sparse, functional, the home of a man who lived without sentiment. A worn shirt lay draped over a chair, a small tear in the sleeve. On impulse, she found a small sewing kit in her meager bundle, one of the few things she could call her own, and with neat, precise stitches she mended the tear. It was a small thing, almost invisible, but it was an offering. She swept the hearth, tidied the few dishes from the night before, and stoked the fire. When Finn finally came inside, stamping snow from his boots, he stopped just inside the door. His eyes went from the swept floor to the neatly mended shirt now folded on the chair. He looked at her, a question in his gaze. She simply lowered her eyes, a gesture of deference that also held a quiet pride. He grunted softly, a sound of acknowledgement. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "An Li," she replied, meeting his eyes for the first time without fear. The days that followed were dictated by the snow. They were marooned on their mountain island, the world below a distant, forgotten place. A silent rhythm developed between them, a language spoken in actions, not words. Finn would disappear for hours, returning with game for the pot or another load of firewood, his presence a steady guarantee against the cold. An Li, in turn, transformed the stark cabin into a space that felt closer to a home. She cooked their meals, her quiet efficiency turning his simple rations into something nourishing and warm. She kept the fire burning, mended his clothes with an artist's care, and brought a sense of order to the masculine clutter. She learned the geography of his silence, the subtle shifts in his expression that meant approval or concern. One afternoon, while he was out checking his trap lines, she found herself standing before the rough-hewn mantelpiece. Propped against the stone was a single, faded photograph in a simple frame. A woman with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to hold a gentle light. She was looking not at the camera, but at someone just out of frame, her expression full of a soft, uncomplicated love. An Li felt a pang of sorrow for the huge, silent man, and the loss he so clearly carried. When he returned, he saw her standing there, and his face hardened for a moment, the familiar mask of stoicism falling back into place. He said nothing about the photograph, and she did not ask. Later that evening, as the fire crackled between them, she found the courage to offer a piece of her own story. "I was to be married," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "to a man in the town, a Mr. Croft. He paid for my passage." Finn looked at her, his gaze intent. "I saw him," she continued, her hands twisting in her lap. "He was yelling at his horse, hitting it. His eyes were cold, like chips of ice. I knew I could not, so I ran." After a week, the path down the mountain became visible again, a thin, treacherous ribbon carved through the snow. Finn knew their isolation could not last. He needed supplies, and the town of Redemption Gulch was the only place to get them. "We have to go down," he announced one morning, his tone leaving no room for argument. An Li's face went pale, the familiar ghost of fear returning to her eyes. The town was where Mr. Croft was. It was the source of her terror. "He will see me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Finn stopped what he was doing and turned to face her fully. His expression was grim, his jaw set. "I will be with you," he said, the words a solemn vow. "No harm will come to you." His certainty was a shield, and though she was still afraid, she found the strength to nod. The journey down was arduous. He led the way, his powerful legs forging a path through the deep snow, his hand steady on her arm during the iciest patches. When they finally emerged from the tree line, Redemption Gulch lay before them, a handful of wooden buildings huddled in the valley, smoke curling from their chimneys. As they walked down the main street, a silence fell. Doors opened a crack. Faces appeared in windows. The townspeople stared, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They saw the mountain man, a figure of local legend who rarely came down from his peak, and beside him, the small, exotic woman in her worn green dress. Whispers followed them like blowing snow. "That's him, the hermit. And who is that with him? Looks like one of them foreign girls." An Li instinctively moved closer to Finn, the hostility of the stairs a physical force. He didn't look at the townspeople, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but she felt his hand tighten ever so slightly on her arm, a silent message of reassurance in a sea of judgment. The general store was warm and smelled of coffee, cured meat, and dust. A few men lingered by the pot-bellied stove, their conversation ceasing the moment Finn and An Li stepped through the door. The storekeeper, a balding man with nervous eyes, gave a curt nod. Finn began his quiet transaction, placing items on the counter: flour, salt, coffee, tins of lard. An Li stood near the door, trying to make herself as small as possible, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. But the peace was short-lived. The jingle of the bell above the door announced a new arrival. "Well, well, look what the storm blew in," a voice said, smooth and laced with menace. An Li froze. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Mr. Croft stood there, a stark contrast to Finn. He was of average height, but carried himself with an air of immense self-importance, dressed in a fine wool coat and polished boots. His eyes, just as she remembered, were cold and flat. They landed on her with a look of possessive triumph. "I've been looking for you, my dear," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Caused me quite a bit of trouble running off like that." He stepped forward, his gaze dismissing Finn as if he were a piece of furniture. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "This is a contract," he announced to the silent, watching store. "It states quite clearly that her passage was paid by me in exchange for her hand in marriage. She is my property until the debt is settled." He took another step, his hand reaching for An Li's arm. "Come along now. We have matters to discuss." The air in the store grew thick with anticipation. The onlookers were a jury, waiting to see how the wild mountain man would react to the laws of paper and money. Before Croft's fingers could touch her sleeve, Finn moved. It was not a fast or aggressive motion, but a deliberate, implacable shift of mass. He simply stepped between them, his huge frame a wall of solid muscle and quiet fury. He didn't look at Croft. He looked at the hand that had been reaching for An Li, and it stopped, frozen in midair. The store was utterly silent, save for the crackling of the stove. "She belongs to no one," Finn said. His voice was a low growl, a rumble that seemed to come from the mountain itself. It was not a shout, but it carried more weight than any yell. Croft scoffed, trying to regain his composure, though a flicker of fear showed in his eyes. "The law is on my side, you lumbering brute. This paper says she is indebted to me." Finn finally raised his eyes to meet Croft's. There was no anger in them, only a cold, hard finality. He turned his attention to the storekeeper. "How much was the passage?" he asked. The storekeeper stammered, looking from the contract to Finn. "It says here, $50, gold." A gasp went through the onlookers. It was a fortune, more money than most of them saw in a year. Without breaking eye contact with Croft, Finn reached into a pouch tied to his belt. It was a heavy leather bag, worn smooth with time. With a deliberate movement, he untied the drawstring and poured a stream of glittering gold dust and small nuggets onto the counter. It was more than $50 worth. It was years of trapping, of solitude, of careful saving. It was everything he had. The pile of gold shimmered in the lamplight. "There," Finn said, his voice flat. "The debt is paid, and more, for her trouble." He looked back at Croft, his eyes like chips of flint. Now leave her be." Croft stared at the gold, his greed warring with his wounded pride. Greed won. He snatched the pouch, stuffing his contract back into his pocket. "This changes nothing," he snarled, but his threat was empty. He had been paid. He turned and stormed out of the store, leaving behind a stunned silence and a pile of shimmering gold. The walk back up the mountain was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. The oppressive silence of fear had been replaced by a new, vibrating stillness, charged with unspoken emotion. An Lee walked beside Finn, no longer needing the support of his hand on her arm. The stares of the townspeople had followed them to the edge of town, but up here, in the clean, cold air, they felt meaningless. The only thing that mattered was the solid presence of the man next to her and the monumental thing he had just done. He had bought her freedom with his entire worldly wealth, a sacrifice made without hesitation. When they reached the cabin, the small space no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like a destination. It felt like home. Finn built up the fire while An Lee prepared a simple meal. They moved around each other with a new ease, the invisible walls between them having crumbled on the floor of the general store. After they ate, they sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance. The photograph on the mantel seemed to catch the firelight. An Lee glanced at it, then back at Finn. This time he didn't look away. "Her name was Mary," he said, his voice rough with disuse and memory. "She was my wife." He spoke of her simply, without adornment, how they had built this cabin together, how she had loved the wildflowers in the spring, how a fever had taken her one winter 5 years ago, swift and cruel. He spoke of the silence she had left behind, a silence so vast it had nearly consumed him. He was not just telling her about his past, he was showing her his scars, trusting her with the source of his pain. An Lee listened, her heart aching for him. In his story of loss, she recognized her own loneliness. She had been bought and sold, an object with no say in her own life. He had been hollowed out by grief. Two solitary souls finding a fragile connection in a shared silence. The fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the cabin walls. The air was thick with the stories they had shared, both spoken and unspoken. Finn had fallen silent again, his gaze lost in the glowing embers. But the stoic mask was gone. In its place was a raw vulnerability that An Lee had never seen. She saw not just the formidable mountain man, but the lonely, grieving husband beneath. She felt a powerful urge to offer some comfort, something more than just a mended shirt or a warm meal. Hesitantly, she reached out, her small, delicate hand coming to rest on his forearm. His muscles tensed for a moment under her touch, then relaxed. He turned his head slowly to look at her. In the dim light, his eyes seemed darker, deeper, holding a question he didn't know how to ask. She traced a pattern on the worn fabric of his sleeve, her fingers brushing over the neat stitches she had made there on her first morning in the cabin. It was a small, intimate gesture, a reminder of where they had begun. He lifted his own hand, his large, calloused fingers impossibly gentle as they brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was warm, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The space between them shrank, the air growing warm and close. He was so large, and she so small, yet in that moment they were perfectly matched. He leaned in, his movement slow, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. She tilted her face up to his, her eyes fluttering closed as his beard, surprisingly soft, brushed against her skin. His lips met hers. The kiss was not demanding or passionate, but tender and full of a quiet, desperate searching. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition, of two broken pieces fitting together to make something whole. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and the beginning of hope. When they finally parted, they simply looked at each other, the promise of a new life hanging unspoken in the fire-lit air. Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, a new day began, but the rhythm of it was subtly, irrevocably changed. When Finn rose to start the fire, he moved with a lighter step. He filled the coffee pot with water, and without thinking, he reached for 2 tin cups instead of 1. It was a simple, automatic gesture, but it held the weight of a new reality. An Lee was already awake, watching him from the cot. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. When the coffee was ready, he brought a cup to her, their fingers brushing as she took it. "Good morning, Finn," she said, her voice soft. "Morning, An Lee," he rumbled back, the sound less gruff than it had ever been. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. Their future was as uncertain as the mountain weather. But there was a foundation now, built of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a quiet, blossoming affection. Later that day, while he was outside splitting the last of the logs from the day before, she ventured out into the crisp air. Near the edge of the clearing, peeking through a patch of melted snow, she found a single, stubborn winter bloom, a tiny speck of purple against the vast white. She carefully plucked it and brought it inside, placing it in a jar of water on the small wooden table. It was a small touch, but it was an act of claiming space, of adding beauty to a place of pure function. When Finn came back inside, he saw the flower. He stopped and looked at it for a long moment, then looked at her, and a slow, rare smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. They stood there, in the warmth of the cabin, the scent of coffee and wood smoke in the air. Outside, the vast, intimidating wilderness stretched on for miles. But inside, in this small pocket of the world, 2 lonely people had finally found their way home.